Hey, Melville Baptist Church, I'd like to have some fun with you in this moment. I'd like you to imagine something for me. I'd like you to imagine a funeral. Not just any funeral, but I'd like you to imagine your own funeral. So down below me in the basement of our church, the ladies are at work, faithfully putting dainties and triangle sandwiches onto platters to serve at the luncheon afterwards. And in the sanctuary over there, the front is filled with flowers in all your favorite varieties and colors. And in the front pews are your friends and your family members, uncles and aunts and distant cousins, and your children and your children's children, and maybe even your children's children's children. And in front of all of them is you in a polished oak box. And as we watch, the pastor beckons somebody forward. Maybe it's a sister or a brother or a best friend or one of your children. Whoever it is, he rises from his pew, takes a ragged breath that fills his lungs, and for a moment straightens his shoulders, this physical expression of an inward desire to carry this grief well for everybody that's gathered today. And he makes his way to the front of the church, into the pulpit. He reaches into his inner suit pocket and he pulls out a folded sheet of paper, and for a moment is preoccupied with flattening its creases on the pulpit. And then he begins to speak. And because we're just imagining you who this funeral is for, you get to hear. So what does he say in this moment? I've been at enough funerals that I think I can hazard a guess, at least at the direction of what he says, if all goes well. The kinds of things that people tend to say in these moments are, well, they're more about the warmth of the welcome that they received in Mom's kitchen than whether the countertop was marble or only laminate. The kinds of things that people tend to say in this moment, they're more about the time that was spent and the lessons that were learned, scraping knuckles with Dad under the hood of the car, than the blue book value of the car. The kinds of things that people say in this moment, they're more about those who had the gift to stop and to talk and to listen and to play, than about the size of the paycheck or the fatness of the bank account. You see, in these moments, some things matter than others. And we don't always live like this, but in these moments, at these funerals, there is clarity, at least for the moment, that some things matter and some things don't. And we would almost all agree about this. And then, because I had this plan to preach through 1 Kings with you, I arrived at 1 Kings chapter 7, and it kind of messed me up this week. Here's what it says, 1 Kings chapter 7, and I'll read the first 12 verses. Solomon was building his own house 13 years, and he finished his entire house. He built the house of the forest of Lebanon. Its length was 100 cubits, and its breadth 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. And it was built on 4 rows of cedar pillars with cedar beams on the pillars, and it was covered with cedar above the chambers that were on the 45 pillars, 15 in each row. There were window frames in 3 rows, and window opposite window in 3 tiers. All the doorways and windows had square frames, and window was opposite window in 3 tiers. And he made the hall of pillars. Its length was 50 cubits, and its breadth 30 cubits. There was a porch in front with pillars, and a canopy in front of them. And he made the hall of the throne, where he was to pronounce judgment, even the hall of judgment. It was finished with cedar from floor to rafters. His own house, where he was to dwell, in the other court, back of the hall, was of like workmanship. Solomon also made a house like this, hall for Pharaoh's daughter, whom he had taken in marriage. All these were made of costly stones, cut according to measure, sawed with saws back and front, even from the foundation to the coping, and from the outside to the great court. The foundation was of costly stones, huge stones, stones of 8 and 10 cubits, and above were costly stones, cut according to measure, and cedar. The great court had 3 courses of cut stone all around and a course of cedar beams. So had the inner court of the house of the Lord and the vestibule of the house. So here it is. We know that some things matter and some things don't. And yet the author of Kings takes a ragged breath, stands up before the congregation of history, flattens the creases in his paper, and begins to read about Solomon's palace. And it doesn't make sense. Well, I guess I should say to us it doesn't make sense, but to people in the ancient world it would have made some kind of sense, because ancient kings in the Near East were supposed to build big, impressive things, and the people who kept records of these kings were supposed to keep records of the big, impressive things that the kings built. This is Solomon's resume laid out before us in cedar and stone for everybody to admire, just like the kings around him. But this seems to me one of the places where the culture of the Bible should be different from the culture of the world around. The Bible should be declaring that there are things far weightier than the square footage of a king's palace. There are things that matter far more than cedar and stone. But it doesn't. I mean, not here. It talks all about Solomon's palace, as if it matters. So I wonder if maybe the author is trying to subtly drop hints that something has gone awry. And they're there, perhaps, those hints. Solomon spent 7 years building the temple, the house of the Lord, and then 13 years building his house. The temple was impressive. I mean, it was big and grand, but the palace was impressiver. It was bigger and grander. In fact, you could fit the temple into the palace 6 times over. So maybe there are these hints that something has gone awry in Solomon's kingdom. But the author of this passage, he's content to leave them just as hints. And what he wants us to see, perhaps, is something else. He wants us to see that the temple and the palace, they're similar. They're of like construction, he says. In fact, near the end of what I read to you in verse 12 and in 6 verse 34, he uses the exact same language. 3 courses of stone and a course of cedar. And the houses are the same heights. If they didn't look the same, they at least looked similar. And an ancient Israelite would hear that and shrug his shoulders and say, well, of course, because the temple and the palace, they're both palaces, just for different kings. The temple is a palace for the God of all creation, and the palace is a palace for King Solomon. And Israel's kings, at their best, they understood that that's the way it was supposed to be. That these temple and palace, they're supposed to be deeply connected together. Because Solomon only sits on his throne because God sits on his throne. Solomon only sits on his throne because God has ordained that it should be so. So it's the responsibility of Solomon and everybody after him to reign as an expression of God's rule. Solomon's judgments should reflect God's judgments. Solomon's values should reflect God's values. Solomon should put weight on things like truth and justice and obedience and faithfulness. The closer the temple and the palace remain, the better things will go for Israel. And the more they become separated, the worse things will go for Israel. And I think there's another thing that the author of 1 Kings wants us to see. That he includes this bit about the palace because palaces matter. Well, the temple is important. It's really important to the story of Israel, but the palace, it's important too. Temples matter, and palaces do too. That's really important because it begins to untangle our twisted understanding of work. Because it seems that Christians, that people who are following Jesus have long been prone to this misunderstanding that there is some work that matters and some work that doesn't. We've long been prone to this misunderstanding that some people do the true, spiritual, important work, and the rest of us just go about our lives. And we find all kinds of unusual ways to express this misunderstanding. One of the ways that we've found is by putting signs outside our churches. We have one outside this church. One of the perks that I got when I became pastor of this church 10 years ago is that somebody took the old sign down and they scratched off Pastor Ken's name and they added my name. So now for every car that passes by on Columbia Avenue, there's 3 things for them to see about our church: the cross, the name of the church, and Pastor John Pettinger. And that feels kind of nice. In fact, when the youth group from my previous church came to visit the first summer we were here, they posed for pictures around the sign, Pastor John Pettinger. It felt kind of nice. But why is my name on the sign and nobody else's? Could it be because we have a twisted understanding of work? Could it be because we think some people do the truly important spiritual work and that nothing else really matters in comparison? Could it be that we think that temples matter and palaces don't? If it is, then we would be corrected by the author of 1 Kings. Because he would tell us that God's creation, it needs temples, but it also needs palaces. He would tell us that the nation of Israel needed a place of worship, but it also needed a place where their king could dwell, where their king could sit on his throne and render judgments. It also needed a place where people could be ruled and governed and led from. The temples matter, and palaces do too. So we dare not do this thing that we so often do and pull work apart into practical things that matter not so much and spiritual things that matter a great deal. We find other ways to express this misunderstanding. It's October. And for those of you who don't keep score at home, October is Pastor Appreciation Month. I noticed. I keep track. And here's what I want to say. I appreciate your appreciation. I really do. But I wonder why I get a whole month. I mean, after all, I get a lot of appreciation even outside of October. Every Sunday I go and I stand at the back of the church, and as you leave, you shake my hand, or we bump fists, or tap elbows, or just nod at each other. And you'll say, "Thank you. Great sermon, Pastor. Strong message. Really appreciate you. I appreciate your appreciation," but I get a lot of it. In his letter to the Corinthian church, his first letter to the Corinthian church, the Apostle Paul wrote this: "The parts of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable, and on those parts of the body that we think less honorable we bestow the greater honor, and our presentable parts are treated with greater modesty, which our more presentable parts do not require. But God has so composed the body, giving greater honor to the part that lacked it, that there may be no division in the body, but that the members may have the same care for one another." Paul is saying the same thing that 1 Kings says, that we can't pull our work in God's creation apart into the spiritual and into the practical. But all of it matters. All of it is important. So if we really wanted to be faithful to what Paul is saying in 1 Corinthians, maybe this Sunday after church, one of the deacons should grab me and say, "Pastor, don't stand here at the back." And maybe another one of the deacons should grab somebody else and plant them by the back doors and say, "You stand here," and receive a little honor as people go out. And maybe they could grab Catherine. And as you went out, you could shake her hand or bump her fist or knock elbows with her. And you could say, "I appreciate the bulletin. The font you chose was perfect. And I looked really hard and couldn't find a single typo. But most of all, I appreciate what you do to keep our church informed and connected. And what you do is really important. Or maybe we could grab Tina and we could plant her at the back of the church. And on our way out, everybody could appreciate her. And we could say, wow, this week there was youth, and there was club DJ, and there was Sunday school, and there was church, and sometimes we left a bit of a mess. And you made that all go away. You cleaned it all up. And what you do is important, and it's valuable, and it matters, and we want to honor you for it. Or maybe we could grab somebody else who is just quietly, day after day, in the midst of everyday life, the hands and feet of Jesus Christ. And we could plant them at the back of the church. And as we went out, we could honor them. We could say, thank you because you show us what it looks like to follow Jesus. Or maybe we could take a prayer warrior whose knees are shattered by faithful prayer. And we could plant them at the back of the church. And we could say, thank you. Because your prayers give us strength when we've got none. Because your prayers give us joy when we've got none. Because your prayers sustain us. Maybe these are some things that we could do to begin to put back together the things that we tear apart. Maybe this could be an expression of the reality that in God's kingdom, temples matter. But palaces matter too. 1 Kings isn't alone in saying this. In the book of Genesis, creation is described for us. And on the sixth day, we're told that God made man in his image. In the image of God, he made him, male and female, he created them. And then God blesses them, and he says to them, be fruitful and multiply, and he sends them out to fill the earth and to subdue it, to have this dominion over it. The idea is that in their everyday lives, in their tilling the soil and raising crops and baking bread and raising children lives, that somehow they're making God's creation just a little bit more glorious. That's the call. The call that's put in front of us by the book of 1 Kings. In, of all places, a description of Solomon's palace. It's this reminder that temples matter. But palaces do too. It's this reminder that your every day washing diapers, making meals, punching the time clock work, it matters.